guess the issue yeah, the light is flickering, but I told him just to leave it on. That's not going to bother me. I'd rather
It keeps attention focused up there.
Represent the Rochester branch of the NAACP, and we just want to thank you for being here in this space and for coming out today for what we see as a very, very critical topic. And so this community forum is really to examine the disparities in discipline within Rochester Public Schools. We are so grateful for you for being here and also for our speakers today who will be examining some data that exists not only locally but also across the state of Minnesota. In addition, I'd like to also thank our sponsors for today, which include not only the Rochester branch of the NAACP, but also the Somali American Caucus, Rochester for Justice, and the Racial Justice Task Force of the First Unitarian Universalist Church. So without further ado, I would like to just jump into what our goals for today are with regard to the forum. We want to review the local discipline data as prepared by Phil Wheeler, who's part of the executive committee of the NAACP. We're going to learn the context of the results as it relates to Minnesota and the state, as I mentioned, and that will be provided by Marika Peppercorn with the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership. Then we will move into a discussion to provide that opportunity for you as a community to ask questions and interact with each other. In addition to looking at the interest in reconciling all the disparities that are outlined. Lastly, we will hear a call to action from the partner organizations and take what we know as data and really look at what is actionable. What can we do to move beyond just identifying a problem and look at what can happen when we work as a community together to address those issues. So at this time, I'd like to welcome W.C. Jordan, who's the president of the Rochester branch of the NAACP, who's going to provide an introduction to the work that we'll be doing in this space together today. W.C.?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Tremaine. And thank you to everyone who has come out to join us for this forum. We appreciate your presence here today. On behalf of the officers, members, and friends of the Rochester branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, I salute you for participating in this important community dialogue. I would like to sincerely thank our partner organizations for joining us and sponsoring this event. It has been a priority for all of us to create an interactive forum for dissemination of discipline disparities information and for engaging the community in conversation on this critically important topic for quite some time. Additionally, all of us have been eager to create an opportunity for you to ask questions of our local education leaders and subject matter experts. We want to understand the broader context regarding these disparities and learn what other districts are doing to prevent these gaps. Most of all, we hope to galvanize us all with a call to action that will allow us to leave here today equipped with ways that we as individuals and a collective can work to dismantle this unacceptable gap in the educational journey of our children. First and foremost, I would like you to be certain of one thing. This program is by no means designed for you, for me, or for any of us to come out and beat up on the school district. Quite the contrary. This forum is an opportunity for us to say to the public schools, we have a serious problem, and we would like to examine it more closely to see the data, educate ourselves, and then begin to determine how together we can work toward closing this gap. However, before we can work toward solving the problem, we must understand it fully and acknowledge that it exists. So this afternoon is step one towards solving this problem, and we believe that it is a very important first step. I do want to take a moment to point out that the Rochester branch of the NAACP has long been committed to our kids and has been engaged as a partner with the school district for years. One of the most recent partnerships that demonstrates our commitment to our kids and the district is the work of a group of approximately 7 NAACP volunteers who have been trained to assist students at Riverside Elementary School with improving their reading skills. This kind of effort has been very rewarding for the volunteers, and most importantly, we believe has positively impacted the kids in the school. We will continue this effort and seek more as we work in concert with Independent School District 535 to ensure that all kids succeed. It is these kinds of efforts, it is showing up as you have today, it is educating yourself on the issues, it is solution seeking and not stone throwing, that will allow us to move forward as a community in support of our kids. To Phil Wheeler, a member of our executive committee, and who has done serious number crunching to prepare the data presentation that you will see today. To the other NAACP members who assisted in the planning of this program, to Marika, who came from the cities to speak to us, to Rochester Public Schools, and to our sponsoring partners. Thank you again for being here, and we look forward to significant and substantive discussion this afternoon. Thank you so much.
So I'm sure you saw the strobe light action going on over here, right? It's a party, right? So we're just going to rearrange things a little bit just to ensure that we give attention to the seriousness of the topic and don't want to have a party going on the side of the stage. Thank you so much. Let's give Kamal a hand for Okay, so thank you so much to WC for providing that context to our event today, and we are going to move through our agenda. That's my role, is to kind of keep us moving through the conversation, right? And also to make sure that we're remaining respectful, and in my role, I want to just make sure we're having that conversation, especially when we get to the Q&A section, but keeping an open mind, right? Being here in this space and making sure that we are receptive to the information, whether we agree with it or whether we understand it at the first and foremost or not. We can have an opportunity to hear the data presented and evaluate that, and then hear some of the things that are the challenges, but then move toward those actions, those actionable items that are going to get us on the road to addressing some of these challenges. So in order to do that, what we will move into next is to have our speaker from the Twin Cities, as WC mentioned. We will have Marika Peppercorn to provide a statewide overview of the disparity data and the actions that are associated with those. And Ms. Peppercorn has been an educator, coach, advocate, leader, and innovator in the Twin Cities metro area, and working for more than 15 years on issues of educational equity. She is the director for the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership and leads the Black Male Achievement Network, which supports Solutions, Not Suspensions statewide campaign. It also advocates that schools need to systematically reform how education is delivered rather than trying to fix the students. So we will, at this time, welcome Marika to the platform.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to be here today, but first I want to say Assalamu Alaikum. Hotel? Abe? Ago? No? Okay, in English. Greetings for the many communities that are represented here in this space and throughout Rochester. I bring greetings to you from the Twin Cities. It's been a while since I've been up to Rochester, but I'm excited to be back. I used to work for the Center for Youth Development with Extension Services, so I was up here frequently. A little background briefly about me is that I work at the intersection of policy, practice, and experience. So for the last 15 years, I've been working with the legislature and legislators to make sure that the laws and policies, whether at the state level, at the district level, or at the school building, align with a framework that is responsive to race equity, multilingualism, and the different special needs that students have in order to be successful. And that includes LGBTQ students as well. I just really briefly would like to see a show of hands if you ever had a suspension or an expulsion in your educational experience. Is everybody looking around? What I'm looking at is basically the same statistical picture as often we're talking about in the state of Minnesota, that is disproportionately Black and brown students and people that are impacted by the policies that we have in place. So today I'm going to talk about what is the intersection of discipline and the achievement gap. And I'd like to start with the first slide following this one. And I just want you to take a look at this picture. This is a young African-American male that's a student somewhere in the Twin Cities that was once in this seat, in this classroom at this school, that is no longer there, will not plan to graduate on time, has family members that are missing him, have friends that don't understand where he's gone, and some teachers that are very relieved that he's no longer there. So this young man is why I'm in the Word, because this is my brother. And my brother, again, I said, did not graduate from high school. He got his GED in jail. And so this work to me is, my brother was 20 years ago, and my 14-year-old son is now. And so each of us have a role to play in order to change the statistics that we're going to look at today. So if you please change the slide to the next one. So by definition, the achievement gap has been discussed for the last 10 years with certainty about how it comes about. But really it's about how are the test scores, the difference in the test scores showing up in such a disproportionate way. The achievement gap also exists where the dropout rates are compared to the numbers of students who take gifted classes. Again, this goes back to the model of tracked learning. And also that discipline disparities contribute to the achievement gap due to loss of instruction and disengagement from school. So this past Friday, the new state numbers for the DERS report, which gives us our suspensions and disciplinary incidents report, said that this past school year, 2015-2016, the state of Minnesota students lost 103,000 days of instruction due to suspension, expulsion, and dismissal. So if you actually calculate how many years of education that we have lost, how many tax dollars we have invested to have children that are educated, that are sitting at home, it's an astronomical number. So I want to take it a step further, because it's not just about the achievement gap. It's about a compilation of historical trauma and activities that have been played and practiced against Black and brown people, so that we are here in this place today, and we describe that experience as an achievement gap rather than a historical conflict. So oftentimes when we talk about the achievement gap, we say, you know, it's the racial and the ethnic disparities, it's the special education, it's the ethnic composition in schools, it's the social economic status of students in schools. They say it's because students' sense of control about the environment that they're in, they have absolutely no control over it, and they don't feel like they have control over their future. And ultimately, it's about the teacher skills at the point of service between a student and a teacher. But most often, we point to family background as the rationale and explanation for the achievement gap. And so I have to say adamantly today, there is no one reason for the achievement gap, but least of the reasons is family background. Over the last centuries, young people, adults have educated each other with extreme circumstances in their background. But now we have a system in place that again tracks students and pushes them out and uses the family background as an excuse as to why our students are not able to learn in the schools. It is truly the accumulation of all these practices, people, and policies that bring us about the academic achievement gap that ultimately gives us the education debt. And Gloria Ladson-Billings is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm pretty excited that we have a Midwestern researcher that has just really shaped the narrative around education about our Black and brown children. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So first we talk about the achievement gap, and then we go to the education debt. And ultimately, it leads to the school-to-prison pipeline. So for the last 20 years, we have fed this pipeline into our school, from our schools into our justice system, ultimately contributing to the sense of massive incarceration that we have now. So the school-to-prison pipeline is a trend where children are funneled out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice system. Many of these students have learning disabilities and are protected under law to be able to stay in school. They have histories of poverty, abuse, neglect, and would benefit from additional education services, which often does not happen when our students are suspended and pushed out. Oftentimes, families sign off and say, it's okay, you don't have to come out to our house when my child is suspended. We're going to keep it moving. And then we have to come to the zero tolerance policies. The zero tolerance policies came into effect during the time of the drug wars in the 80s, and it translated into the school populations. It was never intended for schools to determine or use these policies as a way to prescribe discipline. So zero tolerance is about that nebulous, subjective piece, that one person sees it one way and another will receive it another. But whoever has the authority to make decision on how it's perceived is ultimately the adult in the building. The ACLU does a very good job of breaking down piece by piece what the school-to-prison pipeline is and the statistics from the last 20 years. So I suggest that you visit their website to check it out. If you'll please go to the next slide. So the school-to-prison pipeline can begin as early childhood, preschool, because we have students that are being sent home at the time. Just this past year, the state legislature passed a law that said if there was an incidence of violence against a teacher, that track record of violence would follow that student until they graduated. That's one of the newest laws that we have. And so a teacher has the right, because of that track record, to keep a student out of their classroom. That's a zero tolerance policy. The more and more a student is out of school, the more opportunities they have to get into other activities that are unsupervised and unsanctioned, as adults like to say. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. And this is the intersection of criminality. When we have students in school, the 14-year-old young son that I talked about had his locker broken into, he had his jacket stolen, he had his cell phone stolen. The items were actually returned, but the police officer and the principal in the school insisted that we prosecute and press charges. So they asked us how much money the jacket cost. They asked us how much the phone cost, how much that itty little bitty speaker cost. He got his items back, but did you know that if you have $5 or $500 worth of stolen items, that it's a felony? And with that felony, you are not going to get student aid to go on to college. And so that's where the criminalization begins, because we didn't want to prosecute, and they wanted to prosecute anyway. That's criminalization. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I ask of you, what does your special education data look like when it comes to discipline disparities? If it reflects the rest of the country, it's abysmal. Because students with disabilities are supposed to be protected citizens through the ADA. And oftentimes, IEPs are ignored and children are sent home because folks don't know what to do with them, who to go to for help, and what to do next. If you'll change the next slide. So for a long time, overly harsh and punitive practices have been the way to go. Spoil the rod, spare the rod, spoil the child has been the mantra. But you'll find out the spare the rod, spoil the child does not have a long-term and sustainable impact for behavior. Many times if you would spank a child, the next day they've moved on, they're okay, you made it through. And so research tells us that this overly harsh and punitive practices does more harm and pushes more students out of the system and negatively impacts the students who are remaining in school. Next slide, please. So again, the myths tell us that there is this extreme misbehavior that is sending students out of class. The data tells us otherwise. The most significant reason for students being suspended is disorderly conduct. Again, I say that's subjective. Disorderly conduct was the most frequent use of suspension in 2015-16. So, if we align it with the national and the state data, at least half of those suspensions are questionable. My local work in the Twin Cities, when we go back and we examine those expulsions and suspensions, more often than not, it was so subjective and due process had not been followed that they didn't actually have enough information to demonstrate that they'd gone through all these interventions before they sent a student out. So this faulty reasoning permeates the educational atmosphere everywhere, and it is often the explanation as to why we cannot reach, teach, and love our kids. This faulty reasoning is a rationale for students, and the common explanations include is to penalize problem behaviors as if it will change the behavior. Behavior is taught. Behavior is a form of communication. And that getting rid of the quote-unquote bad students enables schools to focus on the good students. If only we could get rid of those few students out of the classroom, more learning would happen. But when you ask students about how they feel, when they notice that their peers are missing, they automatically go to, what is it that I might do to be sent out next? Subconsciously, our students acknowledge that the student's gone, but they don't understand why they're not coming back. The Minnesota State Survey suggested that half the students surveyed did not understand why there were so many suspensions, even though they understood at large that there were incidents, there were fighting, but they couldn't understand how people were continuing to get suspended. If you go to the next slide, please. We also know, based on the disproportionality, that it's based on bias. It harms all students, results in lower achievement among those remaining, and costs the country billions of dollars. The average number for suspensions a year is about 3 million out of 17,000 school districts. So I mentioned earlier that students lost 103,000 days of instruction due to suspension. So that could be 4 years for certain students, because this does not tell us if it's unduplicated. So if you imagine one student at the beginning of the semester has already missed 10 years, how that accumulates over 1 year. So it's a number that we need to reckon with. And again, we do a disservice to our students when we do not provide the educational services that they are due. I was just a member of the Discipline Statewide Task Force where we were reviewing the Fair Pupil Dismissal Act. And there's so much disagreement about what misbehavior is and what the response and result should be because of behavior, that it's not surprising that people are misusing it across the state and across this country. Go to the next one. So now I'm going to talk about some of the things that are happening to address this really briefly. So nationally, there are a ton of case studies and pilots that are happening where they have mitigated the zero tolerance policies, and they're replacing them with culturally responsive approaches. And again, this does not mean that students that do misbehave just get away with bad behavior. It means that in that behavior, there's an opportunity to learn and build a relationship, and that we will both come out on the other side stronger. And I'm not saying that from a touchy-feely place. It's backed up by research and evidence over the last 20 years, in fact. The problem with many of the solutions that we apply is that they're not given with fidelity, they're not applied in a comprehensive manner, and they're not thought about in a sustainable way. And the next one. So I'll just talk really briefly about the process the school districts have to go through in order to address this. First of all, I worked with Minneapolis Public Schools. And they had a voluntary agreement with the Office of Civil Rights. And as a part of that voluntary agreement, they were mandated to include families and students as a part of what is happening here, how do we address it, and what do we need to do about it. So we brought a group of families together to talk about root cause analysis. Has anyone heard of root cause analysis? Why is this happening? How are we perpetuating it? That group then took a look at the data and took a look at the policies. And they said, as a collective, we're going to work together as a team to write new policies that we believe will be more supportive of student academic success and emotional security. So in Minneapolis, folks wrote the plan, they revised the policies, the school board approved the policy changes, and then it came time for implementation. The community stakeholders had to stay involved, because part of implementation is monitoring progress, right? So you have to continue to bring the stakeholders in together. So we had these sessions called Engage Minneapolis, where we would invite district leadership. At the time, Bernadette Johnson was the superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools. She came. Her folks from the student behaviors and student services folks came. But they were invited to our event. We presented the data and talked about what questions we have and what do we want to see differently. And we had to do that on a quarterly basis, so that meant that the school district, their research, evaluation, and assessment unit had to be on top of it. And that meant that the school principals and the school buildings had to be on top of getting the data. So it took a whole year for us to even get the flow of the data coming around on a quarterly basis. But when we started collecting that data, at the same time that we were applying alternatives to suspension, we saw results. If you go to the next one. I also just want to mention, you can revise a school discipline policy, but it can be in opposition to other policies that exist. So you have the bullying and harassment policy, and you have the discipline policy. So this scenario comes up a lot, that a student is being bullied at school frequently, and finally they just hit their last, they can't take it anymore. So they bring a knife to school, or they bring some other item to school. They get into an altercation with the person that has been bullying them. But the way that the policies are set up, in bullying and harassment, you're supposed to be able to go to somebody and say, this is happening, and you're supposed to be protected. But when these two policies coincide, both people are victims, both people are punished, because the policies haven't been interconnected. So one of the most critical pieces that we really need to think about is the professional development that is required to interrupt bias that's happening in the classroom. And so there's a number of tools that do that, but in order for it to be effective, professional development has to be done in a cohort model, and it can't be done outside of the school building. You have to build a learning environment and conditions for teacher learning in the building. Otherwise, it's a one-off and something that I can check off for CEU units. So the restorative practices, a lot of people have heard about restorative practices. Many people believe it came out of juvenile justice. It actually comes out of a practice from Black and brown communities from generations and generations ago. Communities of color have gathered in circles to find restoration, to find reconciliation. So this is not a new thing that's being brought to communities of color. It's got a new name. It's got a new application. But many times our students, when they think we're talking about restorative practices, oh, that's the white thing. I don't want to do that. That's just something else, that something is just going to be another trend that we're going through. And folks don't actually know that it's often being applied. But the piece about these solutions is that you can't just do restorative practices. If you don't have a relationship with your students, what is there to restore? So you need to transform that relationship to build a relationship to even restore. The other piece is you cannot do those practices outside of a race equity framework, because then it's just another lever that you're using to apply to a problem, but not addressing the root cause. So again, with the restorative practices, you can't just do it in the classroom. You have to have a school-wide model. You have to have leadership buy-in. The principal has to say, yes, we're going to have a team. We're going to have a new office referral form. We're going to have at-large practice. We're going to have ongoing training for our teachers. And that's exactly what we've done in St. Paul Public Schools. And working with a predominantly Spanish-speaking community, undocumented, immigrant, migrant folks are practicing and buying into restorative practices. So it's very timely right now that this is a practice in the school, because not only does it improve the presence and conditions for learning in the building, when harm comes to students outside of school, as it recently did, many of our undocumented migrant students were really feeling upset and afraid with some of the decisions that have been made. Riverview Westside School of Excellence got together in a circle and they talked about how they were feeling. They talked about, I don't want to tell people I'm Mexican. I don't want my parents to go home. So in addition to being an academic tool, it's a tool to build a culture of support and nurturing where our young people feel safe to come and learn. If you'll please turn to the next slide. So the result of restorative practices is increased school safety, decreased violence, a decrease of serious incidents, and ultimately an improved school culture that lives beyond any one teacher, principal, or leader. So many of you have heard about positive behaviors, interventions, and supports. All I can say is there's 100 alternatives and solutions, but if they are not applied with fidelity, if they are not analyzed, if they're not evaluated, it's another activity that will not produce a result. And so working with St. Paul, working with Minneapolis, working with Roseville, working with Osseo, for the last 3 years they have struggled to implement anything with fidelity. And so you have pockets of success. But overall, people are just saying, that's one more thing that didn't work. So unless you have the buy-in to apply any of these alternatives, it's not going to work. If you'll please pass to the next slide. So, okay, let's take social emotional learning. That's been kind of the key word most recently. So people are really excited about it, but the way that it's being applied as an alternative is not culturally responsive. And therefore, the teaching in social emotional learning is a one-off for many of our students. I'm not going into any depth around these. I'm going to give you some websites and links where you can go and explore more information and the resulting research that supports them as a best practice. If you'll go to the next slide. So, I kind of did a high-level overview, and I want you to think about these things. You don't need to answer, but I just want to know these things about Rochester. So individual programs, as powerful and impactful as they can be, need planning and intention when taking to scale. How many of you have been involved in a project that was taken to scale and fell off after the planning happened? That is the outcome of many of our pilot projects within the school districts. I already talked about the fidelity. But the term operationalize race equity is how do you meet on a regular basis? How do you look at the data to pivot when you understand that a particular behavior is either happening with a teacher, a grade level, a school classroom, whatever it is? You have to be on top of what's happening. What time of day is it happening? What hall is it happening in? Is it the same teacher it's happening with? And then how do we as a community talk about these things? Because we know oftentimes teachers that are the frequent flyers that will send our students out, but we're uncomfortable talking about it with each other and holding each other accountable. And it's not just the principal's job to do so. If you'll take the next one. Okay, so again, walking away from this, I just want you to think about a few questions. Why do researchers focus predominantly on family background when trying to explain the achievement gap? What are some structural inequities in Rochester's school system that you can name and call out right now? How well is restorative practices and implementing alternatives with fidelity and in a sustainable manner? How well is Rochester Public Schools doing that? And what about the data? Who knows what, how, and why? So if you asked your families how your school district is doing, would they be able to communicate that, in general, all students are doing well, Black and brown students are doing well, my students doing well? Does the community know? And are they up to date on what that information is? I don't have an answer to that question. I just want you to think about it. And this is actually, I believe, the last slide. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing Phil Wheeler, who has really pulled together some significant data for you to reflect on. And I want you to think of it in alignment and complementary to the ideas and suggestions that I presented for you today. Mr. Wheeler, will you please?
My name is Phil Wheeler. Before I begin, I'd like to thank several organizations and people. First, Brenda Lewis, who's here, for authorizing the extra data work that Afolabi Ronsele and Carl Bakken of the school district did in pulling together the data that I analyzed, and for reviewing and passing that information on to their colleagues. Second, the NAACP and the Racial Justice Task Force of the Unitarian Universalist Church for helping to review the results and making them more understandable, especially acknowledge Alita Borud for that effort. Third, Kamala Wilkins and Heidi Wilkins from Rochester for Justice for doing such an amazing job of advertising this event. And fourth, Jamal Omer and Abdi Aziz Abdi for lining up the facility and for translating. Finally, STEM Academy for making this space available. Our purpose in this forum is to work together to make sure that all of our children succeed. So thanks for all of you for coming to be part of this undertaking.
Bill, you're standing between your audience and your material.
Change it a bit. Is this better? I'll go up there. So from 1990 to 2013, through 2013, I served as planning director for Olmsted County in the city of Rochester. Since retiring, I've been working with an epidemiology group, the Pediatric Asthma Epidemiology Research Unit at Mayo, part-time, very part-time, using geographic information systems to study health disparities. There's an expression in America that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so, for me, everything has started to look like an epidemic. And that's why each time somebody has suggested a reason for there being disparities in discipline by race, I have treated that as a theory that could be tested with statistics. And that's what I've done, and here are my results. First, a few clarifications. Well, let me acknowledge, I think school district staff, those I've already acknowledged them, that's good. When our slides show black populations, we mean people who have come from Africa in historic periods or recently. Not prehistoric, all of us fit that category. Hispanic means persons who are of Hispanic or Latino heritage. I used eligibility for free or reduced price lunch to indicate income. Office referrals are what we looked at, include trips to the office for disciplinary reasons, some but not all of which result in higher levels of discipline, like suspensions in school or out of school or exposure. Now, the reason for using office referrals is that it's a large number. And the larger the number, the more valid the statistical analysis can be. It's analogous to a traffic stop, sometimes leading to an arrest, sometimes leading to a trial, sometimes leading to conviction, and so on. And the data on referrals is from the 2015-2016 school year. And so there's every hope that things have changed since then. And 2016, 2017 will bring some reassurance of progress. Next slide. At the elementary school level, we found that low-income students were more likely to have disciplinary referrals, and that this is significant at a level such that it's a chance of less than 1 in 10,000 that this is due to random variation. And that's what that P means, P less than 0.0001. Nearly all of the data is significant at that level. But we also found that even after accounting for income, race was also statistically significant in terms of referrals for 7 of the 12 schools that were large enough to look at individually. And for the other 5 of those 12 schools, it did not have a separate impact for income. Next slide. For the other elementary schools, for the 5 that were too small to look at individually, we combined them and we found a significant impact of race on referral rates. And I'll explain the slide. So at the bottom are the race categories: Asian, Hispanic, Black, White, and total. The blue columns represent students who are not eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Those are full price students. The red bars indicate those who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And the green bars are the total enrollment of that race population in the district. In those schools. So if If it were only income, then there wouldn't be variation between white and minority students on the red bars. But as you can see, there's a significant difference on the order of 2.25 referrals per year per pupil for Hispanic students eligible for free or reduced price lunch, and less than 1 referral per pupil per year for white students. Next slide. At the elementary level, 2 schools account for over half of the total referrals for elementary schools. And those 2 schools had 9 or 10 times, between 9 and 10 times, the rate of referrals for black students as the average of all the other elementary schools. 5.4 to 5.8 versus 0.58 for all others. Next slide. And so this is the data for all elementary schools. Looking again at the blue bars are students who are not eligible for free or reduced price lunch, so their income is over 2 times poverty, roughly 1.8 times top poverty. The red bars are the students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, and the elementary total is the green. And because a higher proportion of black students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, that creates a disparity by itself. Same as this thing. Next slide. We found the same thing in middle schools. That middle school students who are of low income, who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, are more subject to discipline. In 3 of the 4 middle schools, race was an independent factor exacerbating that. Every school except for Friedel. And then we found for the remaining 3 schools, we found some very significant differences among the schools, those 3, whereby Willow Creek, which has 25% of the middle school enrollment, has 63% of office referrals, and a rate of referral for black students that was 10 times John Adams, even though John Adams has a larger black, low-income enrollment. I wanted to point out that, I'd re-emphasize again, that there were 5 schools that had no race disparity at the elementary school level. I failed to emphasize that. And that, I think, is worth looking into further. So we're up to, I think, the next slide, I think, is high schools. Income is significant, and race is also significant, even after accounting for income. And again, we have a difference among schools. In this case, Mayo and Century have rates of referral for black students that are 3 times as high as John Marshall's rate. Next slide. And this is the comparable chart for high schools. I want to point out that for black and Hispanic high school students, there's about a 2-to-1 difference in referral rates at the high school level. So, as with middle schools, the disparity, as was not the case for elementary schools, but for middle and high schools, the disparity applies to both income levels, both the students not eligible for free or reduced price lunch and the students who are eligible. Next slide. We don't have local information that verifies it, just since we only have 17 elementary schools. It's worth looking at, but I'm not certain yet that we've proved that integration is significantly different, makes a significant impact, but it appears to. But national research shows that students clearly do better in integrated schools, both in discipline and in a narrower achievement gap. And our schools in Rochester are segregated by both race and income, and mostly that's due to segregation of neighborhoods in terms of lower cost housing. But it's also exacerbated by, or can be exacerbated by, attendance boundary decisions. And some of those decisions could be reversed or handled differently. And that would reduce the level of concentration of low-income and minority students in some schools, and the very low percentages of minority and low-income students in other schools. Next slide. So, what we found with this analysis is that if income were the only factor influencing office referrals, we would have an issue, because with the differences in income proportions of students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, Black and Hispanic students would still be subject to an unacceptable discipline disparity. But our problem is not that simple. It is exacerbated by the fact that even after we account for income, we have a disparity that's due to race. Thirdly, the disparities are widespread in our school system, but they're not universal. We have some schools, Sunset Terrace is an example, that are doing much better than other schools of comparable enrollment size and population. The school district is in the middle of implementing the PBIS system, and that can help if we get consistency. Next slide. In working with Carl Bakken and Afolabi Sewe of the school district, we came up with several questions that warranted further research, and there are a number of others that would be worth looking at. But one question was, how do high rates of office referrals relate to achievement? And another one is, if I'm in an elementary school where I have a high chance of being referred to the office for a disciplinary reason, how does it affect my middle school experience? Am I more or less likely to be referred to the office a lot? I don't know. So that's kind of longitudinal data that the school district could look into. Third question, I guess, is similar to the elementary school level. How do discipline disparities at middle and high school level affect learning? And then the fourth question is, we have differences among schools in their implementation of the PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports systems. How will more consistent implementation affect this? We'll do a better job of addressing them, hopefully. This system that's created the discipline disparities, and by this I mean not only the schools, but also the community, the neighborhoods, the retail establishments, the employers, the governments of our community that are part of this, this background that creates these discipline disparities. It has not only failed our students, it's failed our teachers. Our teachers who are not succeeding in educating all their students are not fulfilling their goals. All teachers want to teach everybody well, right? And finally, we need to move beyond the stages of denial and defensiveness and work to fix the systems that are creating this. Next slide. In meeting with the Rochester for Justice, the Somali American Caucus, the NAACP, and I guess one or two representatives of the Unitarian Universalist Racial Justice Task Group, we identified things that we think ought to be done, and Marika's presentation will certainly inform us. We'd like updated discipline data by race and income and other relevant factors more than once a year, quarterly, great. We'd like internal processes to analyze this data within the district and make it public. We would like an evaluation and report to the community on progress in anti-racism efforts within the district. We like the diversity training to be taken seriously, and we like the community focus team, which has been a major way for the community to become involved, to be opened up to more community members, and to focus more on discipline disparities and achievement gaps. I think that might be my last slide. Yes, it is. I should leave that last slide up. That's all I have, and I'm not sure now we want to. Sonic.
Thank you, Phil. And because we have a large number of Somali speakers who are affected by the discipline disparity in the school, Rochester Public School, presented by Phil. I think a Somali translation is in order, so I will undertake that. And I ask our guests, non-Somali speakers, to put up with us while we are indulging ourselves in our Somali language. So we'll be back to you after the translation. Yeah, I will start over.
The mic.
Oh, sorry. So, Assalamu alaikum. Waa fiicanna Soomaa. Dadkeena Soomaalida ayaan rabnaa in aan uga sheekayno arrinta laga sheekeeyey ku saabsan Rochester Public Schools. Sida arkaysaanba cinwaanka waa marka ilmaha Soomaalida ilmaha studentiga ka ama ardayda ka iskuulaadka Rochester Public Schools la canaanayo waxay ka hadlaysaa arrintani in xanaan si miisaaman aynan ku dhigay. Next slide, please. So, acknowledgement ayaa marka hore la sameeyey oo ah dad badan ayaa arrintan soo qabanqaabiyey. Waxaa ka mid ah reportkan dadkii soo qabanqaabiyey school districtiga staffkiisa NAACP iyo racial justice gruubyada la yidhaahdo Rochester for Justice iyo Somali American Caucus iyo STEM Academy oo iska leh facility-gan aan maanta isticmaalay oo noo ogolaaday inaan arrintan. So intii aanan u gudagelin arrinta wuxuu ka dhawaajiyay fiyo black ama madow yaa la yidhaha madow. Madow waxaa la yidhaahdaa qof Afrika ka yimid. Madow waxaa la yidhaahdaa qof Afrika ka yimid ama qofkaasi ama goor dhow ka yimaado ama boqolaal sano ha deganaado dalkan Afrika. Black qofkaas ayaa la yidhaahdaa. Hispanic yaa la yidhaahdaa. Hispanic waxaa la yidhaahdaa qof xiriir ama dhaqan ahaan ka soo jeedo maxaa la yidhaahdaa dadkan la yidhaha Latinaha Latin America iyo South America. Eligibility for marka la leeyahay yaa ku qalma maxaa la yidhaahdaa markii maxaa loo isticmaalay dadku in ay u yihiin xaq u leeyihiin in ay cunto ama free ah ama cunto lacagtooda ay yartahay iskuulka ka cunaan. waxaa loogu talagalay qofka in la ogaado lacagta uu sameeyo because waddankan dadku waxay leeyihiin levels of income ay kala leeyihiin. dadaa maxaa la yidhahdaa lacag badan sameeyo, dadaa lacag dhexdhexaada sameeyo, dadna lacagta hooseeya sameeya. marka qofkii u qalma in uu inugiisu ama loo ogolaado qado qurac iyo maxaa la yidhaha free ah ama lacagteeda la yareeyay taa waxay tusinaysaa qofkaas in ay dad low income yihiin ama xoogaa aynan isbixin karin. taasaa laga wadaaqeynaa. Office referral marka la leeyahay discipline ama canaanta waxaa lagu macneeyey in qofka loo diro arrimo badan. waxaa ka mid ah in loo diro waxay kordhinaysaa in xafiiska maamulaha ama principalka loo diro in cunugii iskuulkii 10 beri ama 20 beri ma imaan kartid la yidhaah ama cunugii in iskuulkaba laga saaro oo la yidhaahdo iskuulka waa laga fiyo. daatahan hadda ama informationkan hadda aynu daawan doono waxaa maxaa la yidhaahdaa la sameeyey referaladaas ama arrimahaas laga hadli doono sanadkii 2015 ilaa sanadkii 16 sanadkan So, arrintan waxay tusinaysaa elementary schoolska lagu bilaabo iskuulaadka maxaa la yidhaahdaa hoose markaasaa waxaa la yidhi qofka incomekiisa hadduu wax yar sameeyo ama uu xaq u leeyahay inuu qado iyo quraac fariiga helo markii la canaanayo loo dirayo principal office-ka ama iskuulka laga saarayo ama iskuulka maxaa la yidhaahdaa laga istaajinayo gurigiisa la geynayo waxa ay ka badan tahay markii xisaabta la fiiriyo kuwa maxaa la yidhaahdaa aanan ayagu fakri ahayn ayay aad iyo aad uga badan tahay so b-value-ga waxaa laga wadaa arrin statistically significant ay yidhaahdaan yani wax aad u daran waaye kumana dhici karto wax iska dadku ay yihiin ayaga ayaa ay u eg tahay in xag loogu jiyo waxaa kaloo laga hadlay arrinta kaloo la fiiriya waxay ahayd qofka rayskiisa madow miya caddaan miya ma hisbaanika taana waxaa la yidhi iyaduna impact ay ku leedahay oo qofka markuu yahay rayskiisa qofku waxa uu ka dhigi karaa in la suspend gareeyo office loo refer gareeyo ama la next so daatahan marka waxay ku tusaysaa ama sawiradan saad u jeedaan calaamadahan kan buluuga ah waxay ku tusaysaa full price ardaygan ugu yimaadaa qadada iyo quraacdaba free kumune lacagtiisu u baxsadaa waa daataha taas tilmaamayso wadan hoos ku jirtay dankaas ku jirto marka aad aragto maxaa la yidhaahdaa guduudka aad aragtana waxay sheegaysaa in qofkani qada fariiga iyo quraac fariiga iskuulka ku leeyahay ama lacagtooda yartaha oo laga helo cagaarka markaad aragtana waxay tilmaamaysaa in 5 iskuul ee magaaladeena ka jiro ayay tilmaamaysaa marka waad dheehan kartaa markaad fiiriso nambarada tan hisbaaniga sheegayso aad ayay uga koraysaa kuwa kale tan madowga sheegaysana aad ayay uga koraysaa tan caddaanka sheegaysana xogaa inay hoosta ayaan moodaa next so iskuulaadka laga hadlay waxaa ka mid ah elementary marka la yidhahdo ama iskuulaadka hoose gate iyo riverside waxaa ku jira referalka ama ardayda in loo diro principal office-ka ama la suspend gareeyo laga ciiriyo iskuulkii maalmo ay ka maqnaan ama laga wada ciiriyo waxay dhacda ayaa la yidhi ay dhacday 3,698 referal ayaa dhacday taa oo ah markii percentage ahadeeda 57% of total iskuulaadka so iskuulaadkan labadan iskuul waxay haysteen ayaa la yidhi 9 waxay haysteen markii loo fiiriyo iskuulaadka kale in ardayda madowga ah 9 to 10 times the rate of referrals for black students. Other schools marka loo fiiriyo ayagu aad ayay ugu badnaayeen ilaa 9 ama 10 mar ayay ka badnaayeen markii loo fiiriyo iskuulaadka kale marka ardayda madowga ah iskuul loo dirayo referral oo ah referralkan aan ku fasirnay in cunugii suspension la siiyo gurigaaga joog la yidhaahdo muddo ama iskuulkii laga ciiriyo ama principal right so tanna waxaad arkaysaa calaamadihii oo iyaga oo graph ah so weli buluugii saan hore usoo sheegnay waa full price inuu dhiibayo kaamil guduudka waa free qada ah ugunaya iyo quraac tan oo cagaarka ah noo xanaanay waa iskuulaadka so tan madowga ah saad aragtaan iyo tan hisbaaniga ah xoogaa yar way ka koreeyaan kuwa so so arrintan waxay sheegaysaa mar labaad ardayda fakriga waxa ay ka badan yihiin ay aad ugu badan yihiin in principal office loo diro ama iskuulka laga dhigo ama maxaa la yidhahdaa la tasbini karayo marka loo fiiriyo ardayda ka yimiday firilada hantida faradeel waxaan dhahnay marka laga reebo faradeel marka Willow Creek iyo John Adams ayagana arrintan ay ka dhigtaan next so tanna waa graphically arrintii oo graph ahaan lagu tusinayo weli waad aragtaa kan oo maxaa la yidhahdaa free reduced ka ah iyo maxaa la yidhahdaa free line dadka qaadanaya nambaradoodu way leeyihiin kuwa madowna ay ku jiraan iskuulaadka ee saddexda ah aynu ku leenahay magaalada oo John Marshall Mayor iyaduna arrintu way saameynaysaa oo still income-ka iyo qofka maxaa la yidhahdaa kalarkiisa weli waxa uu door ku leeyahay in qofkii la canaanto canaantaasoo ka duwan sida dadka kale so tanna waa garaafkeedii iyo yani muuqaalkeedii ee arrintii ku sharaxaysay so arrintan waxay ka hadlaysaa istaadiyo iyo daraasaad la tusiyay ayaa waxay tusaysaa in iskuulaadku ay student iyo arday ay si fiican u tababaraan haddii ay integrated schools integrated waxaa laga wadaa haddii ilmihii caddaa ilmihii madooba ilmihii faqriga ahaa ilmaha taajirka ahaa ay class iskuula wada jiraan laakiin say daraasadu leedahay iskuulaadkeena Rochester waxaa u muuqato in ay segregated yihiin kala baxsan yihiin iyadoo lagu kala bixiyay qofka income-kiisa iyo maxaa la yidhahdaa rayskiisa iskeediyada uu qofku degan yahay iskuulkiisa buu aadayaa taana dadka faqriga ayaa waxaa u badan geediyo gooniyaani dadka maxaa la yidhahdaa kalarka ah dadka hantida lana meelay ugu badan yihiin marka iskuulaadku diyaar segregated way kala baxsan gabagabadii waxaa la ogaaday oo aan soo qoobay daraasadu ay sheegaysaa in qofka hantida uu sameeyo hadduu taajir yahay iyo hadduu faqri yahay ay door weyn ka ciyaarayso qofkii in la canaanto oo canaantiisa ay ka badnaato ama ay ka yaraato dadka asiga maxaa la yidhahdaa wajarka ah waxay kale sheegaysaa in dadka balaaga oo asalkoodu madowga yahay iyo isbaanigu in ay ka duwan yihiin oo si ka daran kuwa cadaanka ah ama kuwa kale oo hantida leh aanan loo canaanin oo ayaga canaanka loo badiyo ayay daraasada ka cadeynaysaa so daraasaduna waxay cadeynaysaa also in so race ama qofka asalkiisu in iyadoo income uu jiro hataa rayska keliya inuu asiga keliya uu yahay qofka inuu ka dhigi karo in la canaanto canaantiisana loo badiyo markii loo fiiriyo dadka so su'aalahan meeshan ku qoran waxay isweydiinayaan kolley discussion-kay noqon doontaa sidee how elementary school office parents affect learning ardayda markii la diro oo la yidhaahdo ama waa lagu saskareeyo iskuulka waa laga aqriyo ama tobaberiya guriga joogaysa ama xafiiska principalka lagu diro sidee cunuga waxbarashadiisa u saameynaysaa inuu iskuulka ka taga may keenaysaa inuu iskuulka ku liitay keenaysaa mase iskuulka inuu ku bata ayay keenaysaa oo canaantu way fiican tahay waa su-aal kolley dadka u taal tan labaad waxay tahay elementary how do elementary school officers sidee marka iyaduna laftirkeeda referalkaa la sameeyey ay u afagta garaynaysaa ilmaha markay aadaan outcome inay high schoolki iyo middle school so tan kalena waxay sheegaysaa middle schoolkii iskuulkii dhaxay iyo iskuulkii sare canaanta lagu sameynayo siday u afagta garaynaysaa ama saameyn ugu yeelanaysaa ilmihii waxbarashadooda so waxay kale leeyihiin how systemkan oo gabadhii hadaaya ka sheekaysay intervention maxaa systemkan oo la leeyahay in ardayda loola mucaamilo si wanaag ku jiro oo canaanta inta laga joojiyo waddo kale oo aanan canaan ahayn la keeno ma laga yaabaa in ay daaweyso ama wax ka qabato arrintan la sheegay in canaanta ay ku badan tahay dadka aan inkamkoodu yaryahay iyo dadka Isbaaniga iyo madowga ah maxay ka qaban kartaa arrintan markaasi soo su'aalo so kulligeen hal meel aan joognaa and system ka saan aragno wuxuu abuuray canaanta in dad loo badiyo iyadoona ugu wacan tahay hantidooda iyo madabka ay yihiin taana waxa ay keenaysaa ama ay keentay in arday badani ay fashilmeen also systemku wuu fashilmay wuxuu fashiliyey systemku wuxuu kaloo fashiliyey macallimiin badan oo dantoodu ahayd inay ilmo waxbarta soo saaraan ayuu fashiliyey oo ay ku dadaalayeen goolkooduna ahaa in la soo saaro arday waxbaratay oo waddanka waxay u baahan inaynu ka boodno ama ka gudubno xaaladda inkiraada iyo xaaladda isdifaaca oo aynu ka hadalno war dhibaana haysto dhibkana haystana dhibka hantida uu sameeyo iyo madabkiisu waxay keenaysaa in ardayga la canaanto si aan kuwa kale loo canaanin aan ka hadalno war sidee wax loo qabtaa oo ayna dhahno system wuu jaban yahay sidee loo xalliya ama loo kabaa waxaynu rabnaa discipline-kan ardayda si loo canaanto in markasta lala socodsiiyo dadka community-ga lala qaybsado iyadoo weliba la fiirinayo qofka as-isirkiisa hantida uu leeyahay iyo wax kale oo maxaa la yidhahdaa arrimo kale hadday jiraan oo keeni karo waa in waxaan kaloo u baahannahay daatahan hadda la soo saaray ama reportkan la soo saaray inkastoo wax badan uu sameeyey waxyaalo badan uu ka tagay ayaa jiro waxaynu u baahannahay in daatihii lagu noqdo ee la fiiriyo maxaa keeni karo in discipline-kan ama ardaydan madowga ah Hisbaaniga ah amba maxaa la yidhahdaa hantidoodu ay leedahay in ay ka bataan in aad loo canaanto markii loo fiiriyo maxaa keena in arrintaana la gaarayso waxaa kaloo iyadana waxnaanaya waxaa arkayno in la qiimeeyo reportkan anti-racism progress to the community in la yidhaahdo community-ga laga caawiyo lagana loo sheego reportkan ah in racism ama maxaa la yidhahdaa waxaa kaloo muhiim ah in iskuulku iyo dadka ka shaqeeyo ay kala duwanaashada iyo qalbadka dadka kala duwan iyo community-yada ay si una u qaataan oo lagu talagelay oo la tababaro kadibna si u awoodaan inay kala yaqaanaan qaabka ay ku sameeyaan waxaa kaloo iyadana muhiim ah in la sameeyo group community focus oo maxaa la yidhaahdaa u furan community members si community iyo dadka maxaa la yidhahdaa bulshada isugu yimaadaan dee wixii dhacay ay isla qaadaanigaan wixii hore loo arkayna ay fiiriyaan in iskuulaadka ay wax ka bedeleen iyo arrinta inay siday tahay ayna codkooda iyo fikirkooda iyo arrimahooda oo maxaa la yidhaahdaa ku wajahan sidii loo maxaa la yidhaahdaa joojin lahaa arrintan canaanta ah oo aad moodo in dadka madowga ah dadka Hisbaaniga iyo dadka fakriga ah lala beegsaday sidii loo adeegsado.
A special thanks for inviting us to be part of this. I want to start off by making a statement, and then I'm going to have Dr. Lewis share with you the work that we've done up to this point. Rochester Public Schools knows that we have an overrepresentation in our black and brown students being referred for discipline rates. We know and recognize that this is a problem. We're committed to eliminating this overrepresentation. We've been working on training our teachers and staff. We've seen great progress in some of our schools, particularly our high schools, with reductions in our disparities of referrals. Some of our elementaries have also seen reductions in our overrepresentation of black and brown students being referred. What have other sites We do have other sites that haven't seen quite the reductions. We're working to individualize our supports and training to each site to continue to work with our community, and are always seeking out our community in partnerships. We're committed to this work and are very concerned about our overrepresentation of Black and brown students in our discipline data. And I did make a few comments. I want to make reference to that we are seeing some improvements. The data that Phil shared with you was last year's data. And if you recall, it was mid-fall of 2015 when we shared with the community that we entered in an agreement with OCR. I think we had our first community meeting in January, and then a second one, I do believe, in early March. Then the community focus team was organized. So the data really doesn't reflect the work of that group. So I want Dr. Lewis to kind of share what the district has been doing, what that team has been doing, that's why I made reference that we are seeing some improvements in some of our sites, but we know we still have a long ways to go, and in some schools we need to provide some additional support. So this time I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lewis to share with you some of the things that we've been doing.
in maxaa la yidhaahdaa dadka madow iyo dadka brownka ah yani kalarkooda in referralkii haddaa aan ka soo hadalnay oo in loo diro suspensionkii iyo maxaa la yidhahdaa laga saaro ama maxaa la yidhahdaa principal waska inay jirto laakiin waxaynu sameynay ayuu yidhi arrimo badan waxaa ka mid uu yidhi waxaan bilownay oo howlo inaan ku tababarayno macallimiin waxaa kaloo jirta uu yidhi field daadaha ama riboodka uu idinla qaybsaday wuxuu ahaa sanadkii lasoo dhaafay sanadkan mid cusub ayaa jiro hadda socdo oo doctor maxaa la yidhaahdaa Lewis ayaa noo sheegi doonta waxa ku jiro wuxuu leeyahay arrintii hore way ka fiican tahay daatahaas iyo riboodkan cusubna wuxuu sheegayaa inay wax isbedeleen marka doctor Lewis ayaynu siinaynaa si ay noola qaybsato riboodkan cusub.
Talked yesterday about how we can expand our partnership as well. I also want to recognize Rochester for Justice. They've been with us from the ground up as we started our community focused teamwork and have really appreciated the partnership and the work that they've been doing with our district. Today we've talked a lot about data, and I wanted to talk about, you've seen the data in a summary. Now I want to talk about how do we take that data and action on it. Our data is reviewed, analyzed, and distributed on a monthly basis. So what that looks like is, Phil referenced Afolabi Ranchaway. He is a principal on special assignment that works directly with me, and his work is really working with our district on the equity work and the culturally responsive teaching. So he takes that data and meets with each principal and talks about what that referral data is looking like and comes up with strategies. So they also get a comparison of where they were last year compared to where they are this year and talk about individual student levels. So we're seeing that this student is potentially having 13 referrals. What is going on with that? What are the supports that the student is currently being provided with? And then talking about what more supports can we do? Because the data is valuable on a district level, it's valuable on a school level, but it's really valuable when we can look at it on a student level and say, what's the root cause here, and what are some solutions that we can work on? We also work with our instructional coaches. Those are teacher leaders in our district that are in each of our buildings, and they work directly, they receive training on the equity work, and then they work directly with our teachers to build on that training that we've been receiving on a district level. And they talk through, they model what those strategies look like. They work with our teachers to say, here's some feedback about what I saw. They model what those lessons look like. And then we do things called instructional rounds, and that is where teachers go in and work with other teachers and talk about, here's what we saw, here's some suggestions that we have, here's some of the great things that you're doing. And as teachers are going in to one another's classrooms, they're seeing strategies that they can directly apply in their own practice as well. We also have, as Superintendent Munoz talked about, some of our schools, we've seen great successes in the time that we've been really making our equity work the foundation of what we've been doing. Particularly our 3 high schools, we have seen dramatic reduction in our over referrals of our Black and brown students. So we're taking those schools, those principals, those teachers, and talking about what are you doing? What are the successes here? And then working on how can we apply that to some of our other sites. Same thing can be said. Some of our elementaries, we're seeing drastic reductions, and others, we're seeing, a different level of support is needed here, and let's really work through that. The community focus team has been something that we've talked about a little bit today, and that's really a group of community members and staff that are in our district that have been working since about March, I would say, on suggestions and strategies for the district. You have a 2-sheeter that goes through the various focus areas and the recommendations that the district has received from the community focus team. I won't go through all of those today, but it really talks about what our speakers both talked about, is the importance of that culturally relevant teaching and to really look at empowering our teachers. And I agree fully with the first speaker about not doing what I call drive-by professional development, or where we have a one and done. That's why it's so important for us to have our team of champions that we have in each of our buildings that works with the training to bring it to life, and our instructional coaches and all of our leaders. So you'll see on those sheets, it talks really about that. And I believe that Kamal Wilkins is going to do a call to action, which he will talk about different ways to get involved, but you have a sheet that gives you ways to get involved with the district. Our community focus team started out a year ago. We, I think, had a pretty representative group. We had about 90 individuals that first indicated interest. I think that we need to breathe some new life into that, and I think we need to recruit more broadly. Today, we're interested in doing that, and then on the 13th, there's an event sponsored by Rochester for Justice. We'll be there to recruit there, and also working with our community networks so that we can, again, get more representation on that. I think one of the pieces, too, that the district is committed to working on is communicating out what we're doing. We hear what the data is. It's alarming. We aren't happy about that. We know we have to make change. It's unacceptable, but what are we doing about it? And I think today, prior to receiving the information that you received, you were really wondering that. What is the district doing? How are we taking action? And that's Superintendent Munoz and I are committed to talking to you about what that looks like. Our community focus team, as I stated, made several recommendations. And now the next step of that, we reported out, I think in January, about here's what we've seen so far. Here's how we're doing now. Our next step is to connect it so that we can show the referral data comparison of last year, this year. And as I talked about, you'll see some of our schools have made huge gains in that, others haven't as much, and talk about how are we individualizing that to each site. And then our community focus team also had a pretty broad focus. As you can see, there were several different areas now. We're really going to narrow that focus, focusing in on our curriculum, our interventions, etc. So those are really next steps for that piece. There's so much more that we would like to share, but I really want to respect the time that we were given here today, and I know that there will be questions in a large group, but Superintendent Munoz and I will also be here after to field any questions you would like.
There is my call to action. So we're going to do the call to action here before questions, just because I'm sneaking out. My name is Kamal Wilkins. I'm the president of Rochester for Justice. You know, one of the elements of this question about what do we do about racial inequality in the schools, a lot of the difficulty we have surrounding the issue is actually calling it what it is. That it's racism. And that what we have to address is our inability to accept that we have a problem. It's really easy for us to push aside the data and say, well, they have broken homes, or it's income, or it's a lot of other issues. When the reality is we have to work within the schools to try and figure out a solution to these problems. How many people in this room are teachers? Cool. Thank you for being here. I think all of us are kind of teachers in a way. That's my philosophy anyway. I think people are all teachers of some sort. How many people in this room are school board members? That's pretty good. Okay. How many people in this room are principals or school administrators? One in the back there. Okay. How many people are equity specialists, the new team of equity specialists that we hired to take care of this problem in our community schools? Okay. How many people are parents of students that are currently attending Rochester Public Schools? Now, a lot of times when we bring this question up, a lot of times people will say, well, why would you have an issue with schools? Teachers are great people. They work so hard, they work tirelessly, they care about our kids. And for me, that's always kind of comes as a double-edged blade, right? I actually personally come from about 100 years of history of teaching in my family line. I have a great respect for teachers. For me, it has always been about how we address the issue within the schools. Inherent biases generally comes from the teachers. Okay? I know people don't like that. They really, really don't like to say we have to point the finger at somebody, but we have to look at how we find a solution to this data that we presented to you today. A lot of that has to do with people's inherent racism, their inherent racial bias, right? And we have to figure out a way for people to admit that.